discovering a hidden past and how that shapes who you are. Your father revealed something about his past. What was it?
He revealed that he had had a previous family, that he'd had a child.
I'm actually in jail. It's for murder.
I asked, why wouldn't you mention that to me? And he just said, oh, you didn't ask.
The man that I loved and who had given me joy, I couldn't put that man and the man that I'd heard about together.
Karen is not revealing something the same as a lie.
I don't think so.
Susan, your husband of 2 years died suddenly in 2015. Shortly after, you received a telephone call. What was that call about?
It was 3 days after my husband had died and I was living in Spain. When I picked up the phone, it was a man who was related to my husband in a distant capacity. He was drunk and I could hear the liquor being poured into the glass continuously throughout the conversation. He was saying really disturbing things, questioning me about why I'd married my husband and did I really know who my husband was and did I not realise what my husband had done and why would a nice woman like me be married to my husband.
What did you make of that phone call?
I was really disturbed, but there was so much going on at the time. I had to organise the cremation. I was absolutely stricken with grief. And I really just put that conversation to one side to deal with once my life was back on track.
When you had that space in your mind, what happened then?
I asked my mother-in-law. She came to visit me one weekend and I just asked her straight out what had happened, what that phone conversation was about. And she burst into tears and she told me what had happened. What she told me I could understand, but I really could not process.
What did she tell you?
She told me that when my husband was 22 years old and he was growing up in Papua New Guinea, that he had killed his de facto wife. The charge was initially murder. It was reduced to manslaughter. The appeal was denied and he did 3 years in a jail in the Highlands.
How did you feel when you heard that truth?
I couldn't put the man that I loved and who had given me joy and affection and the most exciting time of my life, living overseas together. I couldn't put that man and the man that I'd heard about together. The two men wouldn't merge as one.
Were there ever any indications during your relationship that he was hiding things from you?
I remember that he didn't talk about his past very much. Together we'd gone on a search to find out who my parents were because I was adopted. So for me, identity was very, very important. But I remember he would always say, why is it so important? Why do we need to know about the past? Can't we just live for now? And it was something that he would repeat to me all the time. And I thought when we were in Spain and we would not talk about those things, I thought it was because he'd had a difficult life. And I thought it was about his childhood and that he didn't want to talk about it. And so I gave him the space. We did have an argument one night about 4 weeks before he died, and I remember in the morning he said to me, there's something I need to tell you, but now is not the right time.
Wow.
And I look back and I think it's probably what it was.
Why do you think he never told you?
His mother told me, and I believe this to be true, that he was ashamed of what had happened and he was very fearful that if he told me that I wouldn't go out with him, that the relationship wouldn't progress further. And I understand that. I mean, when is the right time to tell somebody that you've killed a woman? He understood my very strong feelings about domestic violence. We discussed it many times. And so he didn't tell me because he was afraid of my reaction, which I understand, but I don't think that's an excuse.
If you'd known he was convicted of killing his first wife, Would you have continued a relationship with him?
Look, it's a really hard question to answer. I suppose it very much depends on where in the relationship that he actually tells you. Obviously, if it was the beginning, you wouldn't. But after you get to know somebody, perhaps you would understand it better. But knowing it after he's died means that I can't ask those questions that I really want answered.
You couldn't ask him what happened. Were you able to find out any more?
I travelled to Papua New Guinea to find out from people who lived there when this event occurred, to try and find out on the ground what had happened. I looked up the appeal, which took me months to find because it was buried. So it took me a while. It probably took me 18 months to find out, for my own satisfaction, what had happened.
What did you find out?
I found out that he had either pushed his wife down the stairs deliberately, that he'd pushed her and she'd fallen down the stairs, which are slightly two different things. And the worst case scenario is that he'd pushed her down the stairs and at the bottom of the stairs. And this is really, really hard to say. And I want to say that I'm not trying to demonise my husband, but it's really important that I tell the truth. That at the bottom of the stairs, he stomped on her. And that's the most difficult thing for me.
If you could ask your late husband anything, what would you want to know?
I would want him just to sit down in front of me and to tell me the story in his own words so that I heard it from him directly. Because hearing it from his mum, as lovely as she is, or reading it in the court documents or hearing it from his family, there's always bias inherent in any story. And I need to know explicitly from him what happened.
Michelle, when you were in your mid-40s, your father revealed something about his past. What was it?
He revealed that he had had a previous family, that he'd had a child, and the little boy had been 3, and he'd left them and come to Australia. So we knew nothing about them.
How did he tell you?
It was kind of interesting. This was at the time that Dad had had like an aneurysm, so he kind of did weird things. He was a bit challenging for my mother, and he would do weird things. So she called me and said, you know, Dad's misbehaving. Yes, that's him looking like he wouldn't misbehave, but he did. And she said, you know, can you come and see him? And this was about an hour's drive down to the beach. So I drove down to see them, settled my dad, because he was always very good when I was there. And then as I was leaving, walking out into the rain to drive back home, he said, oh, you're going to London in a couple of days, I hear. And I said, yeah, that's right, Dad. And he said, well, you might want to call in on your brother.
Oh.
And just like that.
Oh.
And I said, Dad, go inside. It's raining. Just you go to sleep. I need to get back. And jumped in the car and drove home. All the time thinking, what was that about? Why would he say something like that? You know, my immediate response was, don't be silly, this is another silly thing that you're saying.
Right.
But by the time I got home, I thought there must be something in this. And like a good person, didn't use my mobile phone when I was driving. I rang Mum and said, what was that about? And she said, apparently your father has a son.
Oh, so she didn't know
She heard
anything.
at exactly the same time as I did.
Wow.
But she had an hour to ask him what was going on.
How did you get to the bottom of what your dad had revealed?
Basically asked my mum, and by the time that had happened, she's, you know, within an hour, she had prized it out of him. I guess once he'd opened his mouth, it was all coming out. But yeah, we got to the point that he had been married in England. He was Irish, but he'd been married in England and had got into some kind of trouble in the Merchant Navy, been put onto a ship that was unseaworthy, been part of a mutiny, had escaped and then been caught. So he said the choice was essentially he would go to jail and they would throw away the key, was his expression, or he could escape to Australia. And he chose to escape to Australia.
Wow.
And then didn't tell this wonderful woman that he met, that anything like that.
Keith, about 6 years ago, you found out something about your father. How did you find this out?
So, for some reason, I came across my parents' wedding certificate on the kitchen table, and I saw that there was another name for someone my dad had been married to before, and I was like, who's this? And my mum was there, and she said, oh, that's his ex-wife. And I was like, Dad's been married before? And he's like, yeah. And like, I think she just assumed I knew. So I went and asked him, and he's like, yeah, I have been married before. And I asked, like, why did, I don't know, it seems like a big part of your life, why wouldn't you mention that to me? And he just said, oh, you didn't ask.
How did you sort of react to finding out in such a casual way?
I was really shocked because it kind of implied, like, if that marriage had worked out, then I never would have been born or anything. So it was a bit of an existential problem for me to sort of process in my head. I wasn't upset that he'd been married before or anything, that's fine. It just, the fact that it seems like an important thing in someone's life to just completely gloss over for so long.
What did your dad say about it?
There's just that it was pretty short. It wasn't very important or anything.
Do you think the onus should have been on you to ask that question?
You don't know what you don't know, and there's sort of an infinite number of possible questions I would never even think to ask someone. And
Like what?
so, like, I've never asked him if he'd been abducted by aliens or anything like that. I assume he hasn't, but I've still never asked that. And whether or not he had, would he disclose that? Who knows?
So what did you make of your dad's explanation?
It did seem quite typical of him, but I was still really confused as to what else had he not told me. Like, I had to then ask, are there any other kids out there that I should know about or anything like that? But it was all pretty, there wasn't really that much to it all, but it was just still really shocking because I thought I knew a lot about his past, and for him to tell me about past people that he had relationships with and that, and then just leave out someone he'd actually married before my mum, just seemed really strange.
Michelle, did you wonder what else you didn't know about your family?
Sort of, but that was a big enough bombshell.
Did you ever try and find out anything else and think, oh, maybe there's something else hidden that I didn't know?
I actually felt like I knew a lot about my mum and dad. We would talk a lot about when they were children and what school was like and all of those things. So I felt that I had a fairly deep understanding of everything, but there's obviously this gap. And given that I was going to meet this brother when I happened to be in London, it was only a couple of days later, I only had a couple of days to let my mind go crazy. And, you know, I was kind of thinking, gosh, could be a criminal, could be anything, like what kind of person is this? And I didn't really think he might be a really nice person. I somehow thought he would be really seedy. But, and I was kind of disappointed that he wasn't. But, you know, it was only a couple of days to start thinking about it. And then it was like when I met him, just love at first sight.
Wow.
And we together were sort of saying, well, what else do you know about Dad? And he'd say, well, you probably know more than I do. And we went on this sort of journey of trying to share what we knew about my father.
How did you feel when it sunk in that your dad had a previous family in the UK that he had abandoned?
Yeah, look, I think everything about it was wonderful, except the one thing that to this day I can't really get my head around is leaving a little 3-year-old boy. You know, that's hard to reconcile when you have children of your own, when you have grandchildren, when my relationship and my younger brother in Australia's relationship with my dad was one of, you know, adoration, trust. He was always there for us, just a really solid thing. And you think, how did that happen? And the only thing you can say to yourself, the only thing you can think is you can't imagine what it was like after the war, in those times. You know, young man, I think he's probably 29, something like that, facing going to jail for the rest of his life. He was confronted with a choice.
Well, I've just arrived in Sydney. I am about to meet a cousin that I only recently found out that I have. I was 6 when I unexpectedly found out a family secret. Growing up, it was just me and my mum as sort of, I guess, co-keepers of this secret. I knew about my dad. I really didn't have any idea about his other family or anyone else. I had never even thought about having cousins. So I was surprised to receive a message from Daniel about maybe 5 weeks ago. It really opened my eyes, I guess, to the ripple effect of what a secret like this can do to a family and what impacts it has on everyone involved.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Nice to meet you.
I don't know. Hi.
You look like my sister. So you've got...
Oh, how interesting. I couldn't imagine as a little girl that anybody would be in the same position as me.
Everybody was there.
So it's hard to comprehend that there are other people out there carrying the same things as you. So why did your family tell you the secret?
Renee, you grew up without your dad. Did you know anything about him?
I thought that my dad worked at Cottee's Cordial up until the age of 6. And that's really what I knew, that he was working away at a fruit farm or something like that. Yeah.
What contact did you have with him when you were growing up?
I used to speak to him on the weekends, on Saturday nights, when I was at my grandparents' house on the phone, and that was all.
But you'd never met him?
Not at that point, no.
When did you find out the truth about your dad and where he was?
It was just one of those ordinary Saturday night phone calls, and I was just talking to my dad on the phone, and then he said, oh, I have to tell you something, and I know you think that I work at Cottee's Cordial, but I don't work at Cottee's Cordial. I'm actually in jail. It's for murder.
Wow.
Yeah.
You visited your dad in jail from time to time throughout your childhood. During those visits, did you ask him more about what had happened?
So I tried to ask some of those questions, but I didn't get the answers. I then went to the State Library and researched all the crimes myself. And so there was like front page headlines that there was 2 murders that had happened, and they were on 2 separate occasions. And I had always thought it was one, and maybe it was a bit of an accident and all of these things. So I guess it became really, it was confronting because it was there in black and white. And whilst I hadn't obtained the story from no one was willing to give it to me, I kind of had the, I guess, the fortune of being able to see the papers and learn those facts myself without them being tainted.
What impact did that discovery have on you?
I think it was an evolving kind of impact that when I was a child I thought, oh, okay, this is bad, but I shouldn't tell anyone. And, you know, I kept believing that. But then as a teenager, when I was reading those, I guess, headlines and the uncovering of those crimes in greater detail, and a judge had said that my father was a cold-blooded murderer when he was handing down my father's sentence. And I guess in that moment I felt this, okay, I really have to keep this a secret too. Like, I can't share it with anybody because it is even much worse than I had ever thought.
Daniel, you're Renee's cousin. Her dad is your uncle. But as we just saw, you two only just met 24 hours ago. How did you find out about your uncle's past?
I found out through family at a young age. I was very young when the murders actually happened, and being of the elders of the family, I was pretty much told to keep my mouth shut, don't say anything.
Right.
Don't talk about it.
Do you know why it was hidden from you?
Probably because me being the oldest of the Caldwell family, they were worried I was going to end up like Michael, going down that path. My family were very concerned. I wasn't, I was a normal kid, but had a lot of energy. But I became curious a bit later on.
And what was your reaction when you found out what he had done?
Coming from family, it was pretty bad. They gave me drips and drabs of it, like, murders and who and where it happened and all that. So by the time I was a teenager, I was informed of the full story.
Did you want to keep that knowledge quiet?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Nobody knew.
So my baby Grace is 15 weeks old. She's almost 4 months. This experience of me being a mom has definitely helped me understand my mom's experience herself and the difficulties of raising a child. There's also a lot of love for her that you never thought that you would have. I've always known that my mom passed away when I was young because I didn't grow up with a mom. The first time I properly asked my dad about what happened to my mom was when I was in primary or secondary school. What I remember was that she passed away because she was sick. And then as I got older again, at maybe mid-20s, I felt like the memory was a bit fuzzy. So I asked my dad again. And it was only after I asked my sister that I found out the real truth. My first reaction after I found out was shock, definitely. A bit sad, but I also felt like, why didn't I know about this until now? When I met Dylan, it was really easy to bring it up with him because I could trust him.
If Rachel had hidden her family history from me and already told me much later in the relationship, I think I would feel betrayed. I think it's important to kind of break that cycle. It was hidden from her, so why hide it from me? Because you're just doing the same thing.
I definitely think it's beneficial to disclose the truth about a loved one past, especially if it affects you. But more importantly, it's just about being honest because we are all family and there should be nothing to hide.
Rachel, your mum died when you were a month old. What did you know about her growing up?
Well, I remember asking my dad when I was young, and he said that she was sick, and I didn't ask much further because I just figured she probably had an illness. Yeah.
What did you end up finding out about your mum's death?
So I found out that she had postnatal depression to the extent where she took her own life. Yeah.
You also asked your sister. What details did she give you?
Yeah, so my sister told me that when she was like 2, and I was just a baby, what happened was my sister picked up the phone when it was ringing and she got really upset at her, and so she kicked her in the stomach. And we were living with our grandmother then and my auntie, so they rushed my sister down to the doctor, but then they forgot that they left me with her. So they ran back up and they found that she was strangling me. And I think they stopped her and she was a bit shocked, and she ran out the house and she ran back to her parents' apartment and she jumped down the building. Yeah.
What was your reaction to learning about your mum's death as an adult?
I think when I found out much later in life, I think the first reaction was, oh, is it because of me? Because she had postnatal depression after she gave birth to me. So there was a bit of that guilt, and then I think it's also a bit of like, oh, why did I only find out now? Yeah.
Have you spoken to your dad about what you've found out?
I did. He didn't really want to tell the full story. Like, he still said that, oh, she died of a weak heart. And then I confronted him again and I said, my sister told me something else. And I said, is it postnatal depression and suicide? And he was like, yep,
But then he didn't offer any details.
So he was quite reluctant to tell you the
Yeah.
truth. Why do you think he was still apprehensive to tell you the whole story?
I think in the Asian culture, it's also quite shameful to like, this is something that you don't really want to share with anyone. And I think it's also really hard to talk about this kind of things in my family. Like, we don't talk about emotions and yeah, stuff like that. So I think he just didn't know how to bring it up.
Did cultural attitudes play a role in it all?
Definitely. Like, I think he still sees depression or postnatal depression as a sign of mental weakness, not so much an illness. And he was always, like, he would always just say, I want you guys to be mentally strong like me, and that's it. And so I think that's part of, that was one reason, but also because like, it's quite a taboo topic to talk about suicide. Yeah.
You found out about your mother's severe postnatal depression before you had your own daughter.
Yeah.
Did it change how you felt about becoming a mum?
I was quite scared, I think. Like, I could never understand before I had her, like, how you could hurt your child if you are depressed. But then I think that was what really worried me, because in my mind, I would never do it. But I think she must have been really, like, I don't know. It must have been quite severe for her to even do something like that. So I was just really scared that it would happen to me. And I was just afraid that part of it was genetic. Yeah.
How important was it for you to know the truth about your mum's death?
Oh, I definitely think it was really important because it made me really aware of how I was tracking throughout my pregnancy, and after I had her, I just had to keep checking with myself to see if I was okay, and just not to do what she did as well. And I think finding out definitely helped me be aware of my emotions and my state of mind.
Karen, you're a philosopher. You study trust in relationships. When we uncover something in a family member's past, can it impact how we view ourselves?
I think it can. It can change our self-conceptions. And your self-conception is important for how you encounter the world, how you understand who you are, what your values are. And of course, just through a normal course of life, our self-conceptions change, right? But when you're abruptly given this new and potentially important, sometimes even traumatic piece of information, you can get an abrupt discontinuity between self-conceptions. And then you can feel unmoored, adrift. Who am I? How do I process this? What should I do next? Has some part, a large part of my life, perhaps not had the meaning that I've thought it had? And those, I think, are profound experiences of confusion, bewilderment that this knowledge can give you.
Daniel, did finding out about your uncle's past have an effect on your identity as well?
Yeah, it did. I was pretty rough kid. I hung out with the wrong crowds, which probably led to me not having any guidance, because my parents were very much the same. I didn't have any guidance as a child. I was on the streets by 16. So, yeah, I didn't have any guidance at all.
Did you decide at some point you maybe wanted a different life?
Yeah, pretty much by the time I was 20, 21.
Yeah.
I moved back home for a very small period and pretty much didn't want that sort of life for myself. Wanted to be different, didn't want it to be like anybody in my family whatsoever. Wanted to be a better person, make better judgments.
Michelle, you found out about your father's hidden past, that he had another family before he married your mum. Did that change the way you see yourself?
Not really.
Yeah.
Not really. I think I saw it as something that it was an experience of my father's, and my mother responded so positively that it was all okay. You know, I think if my mum had responded negatively and had wanted to keep that a secret, that secrecy itself or everything that happened as a result of that would have changed things. But it was actually just one of life's little mysteries that was no longer a mystery.
Did your dad ever explain why he left his previous family?
Look, I tried so many times to ask him and to get more detail, and he would start as if he was going to give me a really good explanation. He'd say, well, me darling, it was just like this. We were going along and he would run out of steam. And I still don't know to this day whether he really ran out of steam or it was just not a topic that he was able to talk about.
You found out about your dad's past when he said offhand that you should catch up with your brother when you go to England. Did you end up doing that?
I did indeed, and it was only days later. Wow. So we arranged to meet, and I had no idea what to expect, none whatsoever. But it was just wonderful. It was just absolutely fabulous. I immediately fell in love with him. He fell in love with me, and there we are. But no, it was really, really just the best to find this person and to find he had a family and for him to say, oh, you know, you look like so-and-so. Wow. It was just terrific.
What did he know about your dad's past?
He knew that Dad had come to Australia. He knew that Dad had another family. I think he might have known that there was a boy and a girl. He had a vague impression. And I said to him, why didn't you come find us? And he said, well, look, I just didn't know where to look. Pat Gavin in Australia, it's a pretty big place. And he said, but also I didn't know what you knew. I didn't know that it would be welcome or it would be good for you or any of those things. So for that reason, he didn't reach out.
What's your relationship like with your half-brother now?
Just brilliant. It's just a wonderful part of my life. So he's still in London, so I don't see him every day. We are in touch. His wife's wonderful. It just feels like an extended family. And so I'm really grateful that my dad did slip and blurt it out because I just would have missed so much. I wouldn't have known. I wouldn't have felt bad because I didn't know, but I would have missed a lot.
You only found out about all this when you were 45 years old. Do you feel like this omission from your dad is the same as a lie?
Not really.
Yeah.
Not really. I think, you know, I can't sort of blame Dad. I think it was probably a bit of shame or something like that. But it's been terrific to find Pat, who's a famous painter, animator. It's great to be related to someone who's a genius. You know, how cool is that? And I don't think my dad recognised that. You know, he had obviously kept in touch a little bit with Pat, you know, maybe 3 times in 40 years or something, but he didn't have any appreciation of how fabulous his son was.
Karen, is not revealing something the same as a lie?
I don't think so. Lies are almost invariably violations of trust. Not revealing something is only sometimes a violation of trust. But here's the thing, when not revealing is a violation of trust, it could be morally equivalent to lying. So you can't just say, oh, the lies are always the bad things, the not revealings, they're the kind of like, okay, so things. If they violate trust to the same degree, or a not revealing violates trust even more, it could be worse than a lie.
Keith, did you have a right to know about your father's first marriage?
Well, overall, I think it's quite inconsequential that it had happened, but that still doesn't mean that at the time when I found out that I wasn't going to be shocked about it. If he had told me when I was a kid, it would have been no big deal at the time. I wouldn't have given it a second thought, just like anything else from his life that he's mentioned.
What were your dad's values around marriage?
The thing that was sort of strange to me was that he'd sort of made an emphasis on how cheap his wedding to my mum was. But, and being a second wedding, maybe you don't want to spend as much. But also, when I was, I have a son who's about 2 years old now, and he, I'm not married myself, but when we'd initially told my dad that we were expecting a baby, and we weren't married or engaged or anything like that, he seemed kind of upset that we were going to have a baby outside of marriage. So it just seemed a little strange that he's put such an emphasis on marriage, yet he'd been married twice and just not mentioned one of them when he sort of built it up to be this really important thing.
Did it feel a bit hypocritical to you?
Yeah, a little bit. I don't really want to call my dad a hypocrite on TV or anything, but it's just kind of strange that he seemed really weird about it at first when we told him, and now he like loves my son and all that, and I don't think he'd changed anything about it now. So it's really not a big deal. It just
felt strange.
It just seems strange.
Karen, should we be entitled to a clean break from our past?
I don't think so. So I don't think we've got a right to be able to leave our past behind. But I think there's a flip side way of thinking about this. When we encounter other people, we've got a responsibility to recognise that they change, that they can grow, that if you're going to keep holding some fact in the past against them, you might be doing a major unfairness in doing that.
Susan, do you think there's a difference between non-disclosure and deception?
I do. I feel that I will qualify that by saying that I think it's a nuanced discussion. But I think if somebody doesn't tell you something for their own reason, to advance their own purpose, then there is deception involved in that. Whereas non-disclosure is just non-disclosure at times.
Do you think we have a right to keep our past to ourselves?
To a certain extent, I do think that we have a right to keep our past to ourselves. However, when it affects somebody else's sense of who they are and it affects somebody else's sense of their trust in you, then I think it needs to be shared.
Is that something, in your view, that just cannot be hidden?
On that night, back in 1978, there was a young woman who was violently killed and she lost her life. And that can't be, you can't turn away from that and you can't ignore that. I feel that my identity was impacted because he took away the agency. You know, my decision might have been not to go out with him or not to marry him if he'd chosen to tell me that.
Susan, your husband killed his first wife when he was 22. You didn't meet him until he was in his late 50s. Do you think he was a different man when you met him?
When we were together, he always treated me very well and he gave me things that I'd never received from anyone else. I felt like I was loved unconditionally for the first time in my life. And now, of course, I look back on that and I question that because I didn't know the full truth about him.
Have you been able to reconcile the 22-year-old man who killed his wife with the man you married who loved you unconditionally?
No, I still cannot do that. It was like a second grief. So I had the grief and getting through that, which was terribly difficult. And then 2.5 years later, I found out this. And I'm still trying to come to terms with that because I look at it, I think, on one side of my brain, I have the time that we spent together, which was marvellous. And then on the other side of my brain is the past story. And I just can't merge those two things together.
Does that make you look back at your relationship with him differently?
Yeah, for sure, it does. Of course, I can't ever forget what he gave me and how wonderful it was and how much we loved each other. But nor can I forget now what happened in 1978. I'm really tired of being the widow and then being the one that found out this terrible secret. I I want to get up and be able to walk away from it and put that behind me because it wasn't something I chose.
Rachel, did your relationship with your dad change after the truth came out about how your mum died?
Not really.
Did you ever wish that he'd told you the truth?
Definitely. I wish that he was upfront with me or that he had felt comfortable enough to share that with me, but I don't think he was. Even with my sister and myself, he never shared it.
Michelle, what about you? Did finding out about your dad's past affect your relationship with him?
Look, not really. We all just loved him. He'd had an interesting life, and this was just one more thing that was revealed. And the other thing to say is that I'm not sure I would have had a better life had I known.
Was this a conscious decision by you not to judge his past?
It never occurred to me that it was my right to judge his past. It was not like that. As I said, there's usually somebody who leads how you feel about these things, and in this instance, it was, if I think about it, and if I think about it at the time, it was my mum's right to feel betrayed. My mum could have gone either way. It was sort of not my right to feel betrayed in any sense, and I didn't. And my mother was just so, she said, well, I'd love to meet this Pat. You know, he's part of your father. I'd love to meet him. And she meant it. So, you know, that set the whole scene, and I think that's really important. You know, I was asking my girls, my daughters, what they thought. I said, I don't know. Guess I just wondered what else he'd got up to. You didn't seem worried, so we weren't.
Karen, why can finding out about a loved one's hidden past affect our present relationship with them?
It can make us worry that the foundations of which we think our current relationship is built aren't actually firm, right? That our relationship isn't the kind of relationship we thought it was, that it has a different sort of meaning, right? It can also reveal to us that perhaps there is a lack of trust in relationships that we thought were functioning just fine, that they were intimate, and suddenly it's like, if we're close, how could you not have told me that? So I think it can change the feeling of relationships, and in particular it does this by raising the questions of trust and trustworthiness. And in most relationships, of course, trust and trustworthiness are there, but they're there in the background. They don't come right into the foreground and ask for their justification. In these kinds of cases, they do.
Susan, you felt like you had a right to know about your husband's past. How do you think it affected him to keep this secret from you?
I actually feel that it probably affected him perhaps every day, and I didn't know about that. And I wonder about that all the time. I wonder about the conversations that we would have about domestic violence or women in the news that had been killed by their partners, that I would bring up and discuss with him how he must have been feeling when we were having those discussions. And I remember one particular incident, and I remember thinking to myself, he was so quiet about it and he didn't talk about it. So in some ways I think maybe he was frightened when we were together that I would find out, and I think he probably thought about it a lot.
Renee, when you were young, you found out your dad went to jail for murder. When did you decide to tell your husband about your dad?
I think, well, it was really just before we were kind of deciding whether we would be together and make a move from friendship into like a proper, now that we've been together for 20 years, it feels silly to say when we were going to be boyfriend and girlfriend, but like that's kind of, I felt like it was something I had to disclose beforehand. And I do recall sort of saying, well, you know, he was, oh, I love you so much. I was like, okay, but let me tell you this, and then we'll see if you still feel the same.
Oh, you felt like it could be a deal breaker.
Yeah, I did. Well, or I didn't want to keep going without sort of like putting all that out on the table.
You have 4 children under the age of 10?
Yes.
Have you told them about their grandfather?
We talk about it in an age-appropriate way.
Yeah.
And I do feel like, Yeah, it's been important for me to not keep secrets from them and talk about it in a way that it's not something that they ever have to feel shame about. So I think that, we kind of maintain that openness about it, and I don't shy away from answering questions, but I do think it's easier for me, perhaps maybe than Daniel, because I didn't grow up with my father. And so I think that would be something maybe a lot more, I guess my mum did all the parenting. And so I don't feel like he was actually allowed to have an impact in my life beyond his actions prior to my birth. So in actual fact, I felt like him taking that power away from my mother, who was doing the primary parenting, and telling me when I was 6 was actually the problem, you know, because then she had to deal with the fallout of that, and that wasn't a very considered thing for him to do as someone who couldn't be there to pick up the pieces.
Rachel, you learnt the truth about your mother's death before you had your daughter. Will you share what you discovered with her?
Oh, I definitely would.
Yeah.
Because she's gonna hopefully one day have her own family. And I do think that it's very important to give her awareness about what postnatal depression is, and also because I don't want the kind of relationship that we have with our dad, where we are not comfortable sharing or talking about emotional things. I want to be able to tell her, like, this is what happened, and this is what I felt, and you may feel this kind of things. And I think I definitely want to change the way that the dynamics between my dad and I had, and I wanted to be closer with her.
Michelle, before your dad died, you learned that he had another family. Do you ever wonder what your life would be like had you not discovered his hidden past?
Had I not discovered it, my life would be much less rich. It was wonderful to discover that there was this family. I felt no shame, or there was nothing negative like that. So to meet this other family and find out that they were wonderful, clever, many things that I could identify with them that I probably didn't do with my father. My brother is very creative, artistic, and my dad wouldn't have appreciated that at all, but I do. So it was just a wonderful thing. I can't imagine that my life would have been the same had I not found out.
Susan, 5 years ago, you found out about your late husband's past. Have your feelings about it changed over time?
Yes, definitely. So when I first found out, it took the first 6 months, I really just couldn't process it and didn't believe it. And I felt shame about it. I felt like I couldn't talk to people about it. Eventually I decided to talk about it because I thought I really needed to tell the truth, because if I didn't, people might find out anyway. And what right did I have to tell a story that didn't tell the truth? And so now I think the anger is starting to come in, and I have to find a way to deal with that.
Has learning the truth changed you as a person?
Yes. Before I was married to Wayne, I was always a very high-spirited person. Took chances, obviously. I went to Spain with a man that I had only known for a couple of years. The grief stripped a lot of my joy, and then finding out what Wayne had done stripped my sense of being loved to a certain extent. Now I feel like I'm a stronger person and I've made my own life, and no one will make decisions for me again. It's up to me now to make all my decisions. My adopted parents kept my information away from me about who I was before I was born. Then Wayne kept that information away from me. So now I feel that it's up to me to make all the choices in my life and not let anyone else have the agency over me to interfere with how I feel and who I think I am.
Thank you so much. Thank you to you all for being here tonight. That's all we have time for. Thank you too for joining us. See you next time.